Samsung has a long history of designing and producing SoCs and has been manufacturing SoCs for its own devices as well as for other companies, including rivals. Take the iPhone 3GS from 2009 for example. Now that phone had a Samsung SoC. Specifically, it had the S5 PC100. But while Samsung has been an important player in the SoC space for a long time, this journey hasn't exactly been perfect, and many would argue that Samsung is experiencing a decline in this area, especially in more recent years. In this video, we're going to cover many things. First, we're going to go through the history of Samsung Exynos chips. Second, we're going to see how they compare to their Qualcomm and Apple counterparts. Third, we're going to talk about some challenges that the Exynos series is facing, and lastly, we're going to look at what the future may hold for Samsung in the SoC space. Okay, so it all started in the year 2000 when Samsung introduced the S3C 44B0, which was included in devices like the Danger Hip Top from 2002. This SoC featured a single-core ARM7 CPU which ran at 66 MHz. Samsung's SoC journey continued throughout the 2000s and perhaps most notably included the S5L 8900, which was included in the original iPhone and had a single-core ARM11 CPU. Fun fact, this CPU was underclocked from its stock 620 MHz to a slower 412 MHz to increase the original iPhone's battery life. Alright, so now we know how it all started for Samsung in this space, but what about its Exynos chips specifically? Well, the Exynos naming originally started out as Hummingbird, and so this series was essentially a continuation of Samsung's earlier S3C, S5L and S5P line of SoCs, some iterations of which we've already mentioned. The first Hummingbird was the S5PC110 series, which was later renamed to Exynos 3110, marking the birth of the Exynos series. The Exynos 3110 was included in the original Galaxy S back in 2010. It featured a single-core ARM Cortex-A8 CPU clocked at 1 GHz. Now interestingly, the debut of the Exynos series was around the same time as Apple's transition to their own SoCs. In addition to Qualcomm SoCs already being a thing back then, this has meant that Samsung was facing more competition in this space. The problem was that Samsung had to create non-Exynos variants of their devices at a very early stage because of different network support. So this actually started as early as the Galaxy S2 back in 2011. In addition to variants containing the Exynos 4 Dual, other variants included the Qualcomm Snapdragon S3, and so this was because the Exynos did not support LTE. When flagship devices are concerned, this approach of having variants of the same device include different SoCs continued until last year with the Galaxy S24 lineup, specifically the Galaxy S24 and S24 Plus. On the other hand, the Galaxy S24 Ultra included only a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 with no Exynos variant. Even more interestingly, this change was expanded to the entire Galaxy S25 lineup. So what that means is that the Galaxy S25, S25 Plus and S25 Ultra all include a Snapdragon SoC, specifically the Snapdragon 8 Elite, and they have no Exynos variant. But why the shift away from Exynos? Evidently, the reason lies primarily in CPU performance. The more recent iterations of the Exynos series are struggling to keep up with their Apple and Qualcomm counterparts, and it's not just numbers that tell us that. It's also user feedback reflecting their experience. But that wasn't always the case. There was a time during which CPU performance of Exynos chips was superior to that of Snapdragon chips. Take the Galaxy S7 and S7 Edge from 2016 for example, which included the Snapdragon 820 for the US and China, and the Exynos 8890 for the rest of the world. The Exynos 8890 variant essentially dominated the Snapdragon 820 variant, and on top of user feedback favouring the Exynos 8890, this SoC has the numbers to show for it, outperforming the Snapdragon 820 in both single-core and multi-core. This extended beyond the CPU to also include battery life, where the Exynos 8890 offered better optimization than the Snapdragon 820, resulting in more battery life for the Exynos 8890 variant of the Galaxy S7 and S7 Edge compared to the Snapdragon 820 variant. And while I was searching through a bunch of Geekbench 6 data for CPU performance in relation to the Galaxy S7 lineup, I came across this, which I found kind of funny. I thought to myself, oh, these numbers are a little too high. And then I scrolled down to check the CPU information only to find AMD Ryzen 5 3600? What? Also the RAM listed was approximately 6GB, but the Galaxy S7 lineup only had 4GB of RAM. But then I realized that this particular test was most likely done on an Android emulator, so on a PC, where it's actually possible to modify device ID and what such software recognizes your device as. But back to the main discussion. How do the more recent Exynos chips fare relative to their more recent Apple and Qualcomm counterparts? The more recent Exynos chips include the Exynos 1480, which was included in the Galaxy A55 5G from last year, the Exynos 2400, which was included in the Galaxy S24 and S24 Plus, also from last year, and the Exynos 1580, which was included in the newly released Galaxy A56 5G. Of course, the 1480 and 1580 are mid-range SoCs, so instead we'll focus more on the 2400. Now when it comes to CPU benchmarks, the Exynos 2400 is outperformed by the current Snapdragon 8 Elite and the older Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 in both single-core and multi-core. The same goes for Apple SoCs, where both the current A18 Pro and the older A17 Pro outperform the Exynos 2400, again in both single-core and multi-core. But away from Apple, the recent Qualcomm variants seem to also offer better battery life and 5G modem performance compared to the recent Exynos variants. Now, what might have been some key challenges that Samsung faced during their journey in the SoC space, and what might have caused those challenges in the first place? There are a couple of challenges that stand out. The first challenge is thermal throttling. Now, if you're not sure what that is, it's a built-in safety mechanism for a CPU or GPU, which allows it to reduce its performance, typically by reducing its clock speed in the case of a CPU to prevent overheating and potential damage, which is especially relevant when the chip is under a heavy load, like when you're playing a game, for example. Now, Exynos chips have had their fair share of thermal throttling issues, which has created a division among users of Exynos Galaxy variants. The first half consists of users who don't experience much issues with Exynos thermal management, and so that's a good thing for Samsung. But then comes the other half, which does experience poor thermal management. There are quite a few examples of this across different generations of Exynos Galaxy variants, including the Galaxy S20 and Note 20 series, which included the Exynos 990, the Galaxy S21 series, which included the Exynos 2100, and the more recent Galaxy S24 series, which included the Exynos 2400. These are high-end devices and as such are intended to be capable of providing a good experience when it comes to heavy tasks, especially games. So poor thermal throttling is an obstacle to this because it usually leads to lower game performance, including less frames. But what users consider to be more frustrating is thermal throttling when it's not actually needed. So there have been cases of overheating and thermal throttling with users even though they weren't actually doing any heavy tasks, but rather lighter tasks like web browsing and using social media. And you would expect the chip to be able to handle such tasks just fine and not reach a point where thermal throttling becomes necessary for such tasks. The second challenge is manufacturing inferiority. We've already established the clear rivalry between Exynos chips and their Snapdragon and A series counterparts. Now what they all have in common is that they are all designed in-house. So Qualcomm designs Snapdragon chips, Apple designs A series chips, and Samsung designs Exynos chips. But where they differ is with their manufacturing. In addition to designing them in-house, Samsung manufactures Exynos chips in-house thanks to Samsung Foundry. Qualcomm and Apple, on the other hand, manufacture their SoCs externally. So historically, Qualcomm and Apple relied on different companies to manufacture their chips. They actually both relied on Samsung for a while before making a decisive switch away from Samsung, with that of Apple happening at a much earlier stage than that of Qualcomm. And the manufacturer they both switched to? That's TSMC. TSMC has demonstrated superior manufacturing when it comes to both yield and process node, with TSMC's yield rates being in the 80% plus range, and Samsung's yield rates being at a lower range between 50% and 60%. Of course, those figures may vary depending on the source, but there does seem to be a general consensus that TSMC has the upper hand in yield rates. But more importantly, TSMC also seems to be leading in the processor node category, with its 4nm N4P and 3nm N3E contributing slightly better performance and greater power efficiency compared to Samsung's 4nm SF4 and 3nm SF3 respectively. So what went wrong for Samsung and what got them in this position? In other words, how did these challenges even arise? Poor thermal throttling may reflect manufacturing issues, and this is something that we have seen multiple instances of over the last few years, and even further back. Unfortunately, such issues sometimes extend beyond software updates that are specifically released to address them, and it's at that point that we might arrive at this conclusion. Manufacturing problems might in turn reflect a certain lack of focus on what's actually important to achieve for Samsung in the SoC space. And we are sort of starting to see actions that might be categorized as the consequences of this lack of focus. For example, a few months ago, Samsung was said to be cutting foundry investment in half, going from $7 billion down to $3.5 billion, which contradicts what rivals are doing. We see that, on the other hand, companies like TSMC and Intel are expected to invest more in this space. This decision from Samsung supposedly reflects lower client demand and efforts to improve efficiency. Samsung is said to be facing difficulties in signing deals with big companies because of delays in advanced manufacturing processes and lower yield rates than expected, which was something we discussed earlier in the video. Some would argue that the lack of focus also resulted from Samsung's reliance on Qualcomm chips to begin with. This perspective suggests that if Samsung tried to overcome the barriers towards selling Exynos variants of Galaxy devices in countries where it has typically sold Snapdragon variants, it wouldn't have needed to rely on Qualcomm chips in the first place, allowing them to focus their efforts fully on maximizing the quality of Exynos chips, and as a result, we could have potentially seen Samsung in a better position today. So what does the future hold for Samsung in the SoC space? Well, it's very interesting. The Exynos 2500 series was supposed to debut on the Galaxy S25 and S25 Plus, but Samsung unfortunately failed to mass produce this chip within the deadline for the release of those devices. But with that being said, the Exynos 2500 is expected to power the upcoming Galaxy Z Flip 7. So that will be a 3nm processed chip, and it's set to include a 10-core CPU. It's definitely going to be very interesting to see how it performs if this ends up being true. But what's more interesting is the Exynos 2600, which may be included in the upcoming Galaxy S26 lineup. This is supposed to be Samsung's 2nm process milestone, allowing for higher performance and more power efficiency. A trial production run of this SoC was said to have achieved a 30% yield, which, for a 2nm process chip, is considered decent progress, although improvement is still needed. To do this, Samsung appears to have formed a special team to monitor all efforts to improve the manufacturing process for this chip. This sounds rather promising to me personally, but of course we'll have to wait and see. What's also going to be interesting is how the competition between Samsung and TSMC will unfold going forward. Over the last few months, reports have shown a bit of a back and forth between the two companies, including TSMC rejecting an offer from Samsung to manufacture its Exynos chips, and also TSMC potentially facing a challenge with securing orders for 2nm process chips. With Samsung focusing on the Exynos 2600, which is expected to be built on a 2nm process, and Apple likely choosing to stick to 3nm for its upcoming A19 series. Could this be an opportunity for Samsung to improve its position in the space? Right now, TSMC holds an overwhelming 67% market share, while Samsung holds just under 10%. So obviously the question of whether Samsung can overtake TSMC is largely an unrealistic one, at least right now, since Samsung would have a huge mountain to climb. But when it comes to the quality of the SoCs themselves, anything is possible. But what do you think about this? Do you think future Exynos chips will make a comeback against Snapdragon and A-series chips? Or do you think that Qualcomm and Apple are in a league of their own now? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts, so feel free to let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this video, which was incredibly challenging to make. If you did enjoy it, please like, share and subscribe. And feel free to let me know in the comments if there is anything tech you're interested in and want me to make a video about. In the next video, we're going to shift our focus to what we might know about iOS 19 so far. Make sure to tune in for that because it's going to be very interesting. Also, please consider supporting me by donating to my channel through buymeacoffee.com. I would really appreciate any support as I continue to bring fun and interesting content like this. Only if you can, of course. Link down below. This was the Wizard of Tech, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.